Welcome along to episode 2 of this vlog series. I've just spent a day in Seattle, but before that, just in case you haven't seen episode 1, let's get caught up. Yesterday I boarded Royal Caribbean's Ovation of the Seas in Vancouver, Canada, and I'm on board for the next 4 weeks as we cross the Pacific Ocean, arriving in Sydney, Australia on the 29th of October. Along the way, we'll have stops in Hawaii, French Polynesia and New Zealand before arriving in Sydney. We sailed from Canada Place yesterday afternoon shortly after 4 p.m, and given the short distance between there and Seattle, we had what I would consider to be a pretty leisurely sail. We seemed to be docked by about 5 a.m. this morning, so now it's time to start exploring Seattle for the day. Considering the perception that it always rains in Seattle, I was pleasantly surprised at the weather today. It was warm, dry and sunny, perfect for the 1st of October. Now, in practical terms, we docked this morning at Pier 91, which is part of the Smith Cove Cruise Terminal. There are 2 terminals in Seattle, and this terminal is by far the largest. It accommodates the vast majority of cruise lines out of Seattle, but it is the furthest from downtown. Now, for the day in port, I opted to explore independently. Generally, my philosophy regarding shore excursions is, if it's a destination that I would be comfortable going on a land-based holiday and doing my own thing, well then I'd prefer to do the same when I get off a ship. It does, however, depend on the timing as well, so I would always be cautious of that. If it's a particularly short day, I'll stick with the safety of a cruise line organised shore excursion. To get to the downtown area to begin my day of exploration, I opted to use Royal Caribbean's transfer shuttle. At a cost of $20 return, this was a fairly quick and efficient way. It took about 15 minutes drive time. I believe the walk would take about an hour and 10 minutes based on the map that you see there. Now, the shuttle drop-off point in downtown was close to the junction of 2nd Avenue and Pine Street, so very well located to access a lot of the main attractions. My plan, firstly, was to head towards the Space Needle. To get there, I took a 5-minute walk to the monorail station at the Westlake Centre, and after boarding the monorail, it took just 5 minutes to get to its terminus point at Seattle Centre. So this is the entire complex in which the Space Needle is located. Given that it felt like most of Seattle downtown was still asleep at 9:30 on a Saturday morning, I was congratulating myself on a job well done in getting to the Space Needle so early. Unfortunately, that's where things came a little bit unstuck. I hadn't booked tickets in advance. I assumed there would just be a short queue. Unfortunately, I found that there were a lot of advance reservations, and the earliest time that I could be permitted to join the queue was actually at 11 a.m. Although this was going to eat into my exploration time, as the Space Needle was my number 1 attraction for the day, I decided it was worth the wait. Now, within the Seattle Centre complex, there are a number of other attractions. The Chihuly, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the Chihuly Gardens and Glass Museum is adjacent. Based on information online, it appears that at least 1 to 2 hours are needed to explore that, so I didn't go for it. Eventually, 11 a.m. came and I joined the queue. Now, it felt like it was a pretty slow-moving queue as it wound its way up towards the elevators, but eventually it was my turn to board what was a very, very fast-moving elevator to the top of the Space Needle. From there, given that it was such a clear day, there were wonderful views all over the city and out to sea. And there's our cruise ship in the distance. For anyone who isn't a fan of heights, and I would include myself in that, I would say don't let this put you off. As a first-time visitor to Seattle, I think this is a must-do. And once you're up at the top of the Space Needle, it feels perfectly secure. It's all enclosed behind glass, so really it takes away the fear of the height. Perhaps it would be a good idea not to actually walk on the glass surface though. That's one of my top tips. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are 2 cruise terminals in Seattle. So the one that you can see in the distance there is the larger Smith Cove terminal, and the one that you can see just here is the other terminal, which is closer to downtown and is used by NCL. So after my trip to the Space Needle, it was then time to head off to Seattle's other famous attraction, Pike's Place Public Market. This started as a farmers market back in 1907 and has operated continuously since then. Now, on a Saturday, it was incredibly busy. And the nice thing about this, and something I really like to see in places, it's not just a tourist hangout. It very much seemed to be some place that was populated by locals also experiencing it. So on the main level, there are lots of crafts and food stalls and flower stalls. On the lower level, there are restaurants and there are individual shops. It's possible that you could spend hours browsing through here, but unfortunately I didn't have time for that. Now just opposite that is the first Starbucks. Honestly, because it didn't have all of the corporate logos and branding that we see nowadays, it seemed to have more of the traditional shop front. I wouldn't actually have noticed it had it not been for the very, very large queue waiting to get in. As I'm not a coffee lover, I didn't join the queue. Now unfortunately at this point, while I had hoped to get down to the waterfront and maybe even take a spin in the Ferris wheel, time just wasn't on my side. Technically, having got the 9 a.m. shuttle bus, I was actually meant to be on the return bus at 1 p.m, but I definitely wasn't going to make that. I decided I'd risk trying to get on a later shuttle, and if not, worst case, I'd just get a taxi back to the port. I had a quick stop in the Target store before boarding the bus, more about that later, and I was able to successfully get on the 2 p.m. bus, so no problem on that front, and arrive safely back at the port well in advance of the all aboard time. Now let's talk some practical shopping tips for just a second. Firstly, you'll see that I succumbed to the temptation of those lovely flowers at the market. So I purchased those, wasn't quite sure if I was going to be able to take them on board, and the answer is yes, I could. Essentially, there's no problem in taking flowers on board a ship, at least in most ports, but you can't actually take them off. And I certainly didn't expect that they'll still be fresh by the time we get to Hawaii in any case. The other practical shopping tip, I mentioned having stopped at a Target store. I was quite amused to find that the vast majority of people boarding the shuttle bus back to the ship all had Target shopping bags. Bearing in mind that we're going to be at sea for the next 5 days, this was the last opportunity to stock up on any of the essentials, or perhaps the not so essentials. As you'll see, my shopping bag contained some sweet treats. And yes, I know we're on a cruise ship, and yes, I know the food is plentiful, but there are times where you just want a little snack. And while sweet treats like chocolate or crisps can be purchased on board undoubtedly, for those who may not have cruised before, you should be aware that it does come at quite a hefty price tag. While I asked my room steward for a flower vase, unfortunately they don't seem to be in ready supply. So in the absence of that, there was a need to improvise. That's the reason for the flowers in the mug from the tea tray. Later, after I returned to my cabin for some balcony time, it was absolutely fascinating to watch what was going on the dockside. It was basically the end of the process of all the supplies being taken on board for our trip across the Pacific. Now, when I looked out early in the morning after we docked, this whole area was absolutely full of goods and supplies for the trip. The process was concluding this afternoon, so I'm hoping that Royal Caribbean have this down to a fine art. Basically, all throughout the Alaska season, Ovation of the Seas has been home ported here in Seattle, doing round trip 7 days to Alaska. So hopefully they've had it down to a fine art by doing this week after week after week. Let's hope they haven't forgotten anything essential. The ship was due to set sail around 5 p.m, but actually ended up being delayed until about 7. I'm not quite sure the reason why. But what it meant was that there was the benefit of firstly being able to watch the Holland America Eurodam ship setting sail, and after that to enjoy a really beautiful sunset. That was an unexpected bonus that I hadn't anticipated. That all happened before I headed out for the evening to enjoy one of the first shows in the theatre, which was a comedian. Quite funny, observational, a lot of commentary about the delays that we all experienced in Vancouver on boarding day yesterday. Now, before turning in for the night, I thought it might be useful to give you a quick summary of basically the cost of my day independently exploring Seattle. To do things similar to a shore excursion offered by the cruise line, my budget came in at a total of just over $70. So for that, it involved transport, it involved the Space Needle, and it involved exploring Pike's Place Market, which obviously that itself is free. Overall, I think it was a cost-effective way to explore the city. It was enjoyable. I had a degree of freedom to do things at my own pace, although obviously, as we're about to head out for 5 days crossing the Pacific, there was a need to ensure being back on time. Catching up with the next port really wasn't going to work in this situation. If you've enjoyed following along on my day in Seattle, please consider hitting the like button. And if you want to keep up to date on the rest of what happens on this 4-week cruise across the Pacific, please consider subscribing. For now, thank you so much for watching, and good night. The ship was due to set sail around 5 pm but actually ended up being delayed until about 7. I'm not quite sure the reason why, but what it meant was that there was the benefit of firstly being able to watch the Holland America Eurodam ship setting sail, and after that to enjoy a really beautiful sunset. That was an unexpected bonus that I hadn't anticipated. That all happened before I headed out for the evening to enjoy one of the first shows in the theatre, which was a comedian. Quite funny, observational, a lot of commentary about the delays that we all experienced in Vancouver on boarding day yesterday.